May 1944, Guadalcanal. The Japanese naval officer stared at the American lieutenant who had just offered him a cigarette. After 16 months translating coded messages for the Imperial Japanese Navy, Lieutenant Kenji Takahashi had been warned what would happen if captured. Death was preferable to the torture Americans inflicted on prisoners. Yet here was this American, speaking broken Japanese, holding out a pack of lucky strikes as if they were meeting at a social gathering, rather than an interrogation. Across the Pacific battlefields of 1944, a profound reversal of expectations was occurring among the 135 Japanese military translators who fell into American hands. These men, university-educated, fluent in English, trained in complex military communication systems, discovered that American captivity contradicted everything imperial propaganda had taught them about Western barbarism. 3 days earlier, Takahashi had been pulled unconscious from the water after his transport ship was sunk by American aircraft. He had destroyed his codebooks before jumping overboard, prepared to die rather than surrender. The shock of waking in an American field hospital, receiving treatment identical to wounded American sailors, began his disorientation. This psychological disruption would soon be magnified 100-fold. "I expected to be tortured immediately," Takahashi later recalled in a 1978 interview for the War College archives. "Instead, they gave me coffee with sugar and asked if my wounds were painful." This kindness was more disorienting than any physical torture could have been. Military intelligence records show that by mid-1944, American forces had captured 35 Japanese naval translators and 98 Army translators, most with specialized training in encryption and military communications. These men represented an unexpected intelligence resource in a conflict where qualified American Japanese language specialists remained critically scarce. The Japanese military's pre-war language training program had produced 1,142 specialized military translators by 1941, selecting candidates from top universities who showed aptitude in English. These men underwent rigorous 2-year programs focusing on technical vocabulary, encryption systems, and military terminology. Their capture represented an intelligence windfall if Americans could overcome the cultural barriers to utilizing their knowledge. Imperial military doctrine had been explicit: surrender meant disgrace, and those who dishonored Japan by being captured alive should expect only punishment from family and countrymen. This indoctrination was reinforced by specific warnings to translators who handled Japan's most sensitive communications. Training manuals recovered from a communications school in Osaka contained explicit instructions. Those who possess knowledge of imperial codes must destroy themselves rather than fall into enemy hands. Survival in captivity will be treated as treason. Yet American interrogation teams had developed approaches that defied Japanese expectations. At the Joint Intelligence Center Pacific Ocean Areas, JICPOA on Hawaii, and the Allied Translator and Interpreter Section, ATIS in Australia, innovative intelligence officers created interrogation environments that deliberately contradicted Japanese propaganda about American brutality. Captain Richard Schmidt of JICPOA, who had studied at Kyoto University before the war, pioneered techniques that leveraged cultural understanding rather than coercion. Interrogation rooms featured traditional floor cushions rather than harsh chairs. Green tea was offered instead of coffee when available. Conversations began with discussions of literature or art rather than military demands. "We discovered that contradicting their expectations created cognitive openings," Schmidt wrote in his classified 1946 report on interrogation techniques. When a Japanese translator expecting torture received respect, the psychological impact was substantial. At the temporary holding facility on Guadalcanal where Takahashi was processed, American interrogators had transformed a bombed-out school building into a specialized facility. The main interrogation room, 120 square feet with windows facing a flowering bougainvillea, had been deliberately designed to create a scholarly atmosphere rather than a prison. Bookshelves held Japanese literature alongside military manuals. A portrait of President Roosevelt hung opposite a carefully maintained Japanese landscape painting. The physical environment represented just one aspect of the psychological approach. The presence of Nisei, second-generation Japanese-American, translators created particular dissonance for prisoners. Military intelligence had recruited 6,000 Japanese Americans into the military intelligence service, with 3,700 serving in the Pacific. These Nisei straddled both cultures, often speaking Japanese with regional accents identical to those of the prisoners. Sergeant Tom Yamamoto, a Nisei from San Francisco whose parents remained in an internment camp in California, conducted Takahashi's initial intake interview. Speaking the formal Japanese of Takahashi's home region, Yamamoto explained the Geneva Conventions and prisoner rights in cultural terms that resonated with Japanese concepts of honor. The measured respect shown by American forces, particularly while ferocious fighting continued throughout the Pacific, contradicted the fundamental Japanese military assertion that Americans were barbaric devils incapable of civilization. This contradiction created the first fracture in the ideological armor of captured translators. As Takahashi finished his cigarette on his third day of captivity, Major William Davis entered the room carrying a folder of intercepted Japanese messages. Speaking through Sergeant Yamamoto, he made the offer that would fundamentally transform the war's intelligence landscape. Lieutenant Takahashi, we need your expertise on some technical language matters. Would you be willing to assist us with translating some routine material? The request, delivered casually, represented an earthquake in Takahashi's moral universe. The unthinkable had been asked in the most ordinary manner possible. In this moment of crisis, the path that would lead Japanese translators from captives to collaborators to cultural bridges was being laid, one impossible ethical decision at a time. July 1944. Camp Tracy, California. The typewritten document trembled slightly in Lieutenant Takahashi's hands as he read the proposed agreement. The American security clearance form, translated into formal Japanese, outlined his potential role as a technical language consultant to Allied intelligence services. The euphemism barely disguised the reality. He was being asked to help interrogate his own countrymen, possibly his own commanding officers. The Allied Translator and Interpreter Section, ATIS, faced a monumental challenge by mid-1944. American intelligence had intercepted 18,000 Japanese military documents and captured 240 prisoners, requiring interrogation each month. Yet despite wartime mobilization, qualified American translators remained dangerously scarce. The U.S. Navy Japanese Language School at Boulder, Colorado, and the Army's program at Fort Snelling, Minnesota, together produced just 2,059 trained linguists during the entire war, far below operational needs. Major Wallace Moore of ATIS later wrote in his classified assessment, "We faced a critical shortage that threatened the entire Pacific intelligence operation. We could intercept Japanese communications, but lacked sufficient qualified personnel to translate them within tactically useful timeframes." The backlog of untranslated documents had reached 68,000 pages by June 1944, with priority materials taking 14 to 21 days for processing, an eternity in combat conditions. This shortage led to what Colonel Sidney Mashbeer, commanding officer of ATS, called our most unconventional intelligence innovation. Beginning with careful experiments in Australia, Allied intelligence began cautiously employing captured Japanese translators to assist with non-sensitive materials, weather reports, supply requisitions, and routine communications. Captain James Anderson, who developed the program, established precise protocols for working with Japanese prisoners. "We started with absolutely non-critical documents," his operational report stated. "Material where accuracy could be verified through other means. Translators worked under constant supervision, with Nisei specialists checking every character they produced. The unexpected success of these early collaborations, a 318% increase in document processing speed with 94% accuracy, led to the program's careful expansion. By July 1944, 23 Japanese translators had agreed to provide limited assistance. Their motives varied. Some were academicians drafted into military service, who had never embraced militarism. Others were pragmatists who recognized Japan's deteriorating position. A few were simply grateful for humane treatment and responded to personal connections with their American counterparts. Naoji Kimura, a naval translator captured at Tarawa, described his reasoning in a post-war memoir. "I had been taught Americans were beasts who would torture prisoners. When they instead treated me with professional courtesy, I began to question everything I'd been told. By the time they asked for my assistance with technical documents, I had already begun doubting Japan's propaganda." The American approach to recruitment was psychologically sophisticated. Rather than demanding collaboration, intelligence officers emphasized professional respect between fellow linguists. They positioned potential collaboration as technical assistance rather than betrayal. Captain Richard Sakakida, a Nisei officer who had lived undercover in Japan before the war, pioneered relationship-building techniques that recognized the impossible position of potential collaborators. "We never pressured them to violate their sense of honor," Sakakida wrote. "Instead, we demonstrated that translating technical material or explaining cultural references didn't compromise their integrity. It was a gradual process of building trust." The physical environment of Camp Tracy, located 20 miles east of San Francisco, reflected this approach. Unlike standard POW facilities, this specialized compound featured private quarters for the 15 Japanese translators housed there. Each had an 8x 10-foot room with a desk, bookshelf, and window. Meals included traditional Japanese dishes prepared by a Japanese-American cook from San Francisco's Japantown. These conditions, modest by civilian standards but luxurious compared to frontline military life, created an atmosphere more academic than punitive. For many Japanese translators, the most psychologically significant element wasn't physical comfort, but intellectual respect. Lieutenant Hiroshi Matsuda, an English literature graduate from Tokyo Imperial University, before being drafted as a military translator, described the impact of engaging with American intelligence officers as intellectual equals. "For 3 years in the military, my education had been irrelevant except for language skills. When American officers discussed Hemingway or Faulkner with me while analyzing documents, I felt human again." The moral quandary intensified as trust grew. Initial document translation expanded to providing cultural context for interrogations. A Japanese officer might use idioms or cultural references impenetrable to even skilled American translators. Explaining these subtleties inevitably helped Americans understand Japanese communications better, indirectly aiding the war effort against their homeland. Major William Davis of ATIS documented this evolution. "We progressed from asking for literal translations to seeking cultural insights. A captured message might mention Operation White Chrysanthemum. Our Nisei translators might recognize this as a military code, but Japanese collaborators could explain its cultural significance and potential meaning within Japanese military thinking." For Lieutenant Takahashi, sitting in the sunlit office at Camp Tracy, the agreement before him represented the culmination of this progression. The document requested his assistance with direct interpretation services during specialized interviews. The careful phrasing masked the reality. He would be in the room while Japanese officers, men like himself, perhaps even men he had served under, were interrogated. His American handler, Captain Thomas Wilson, waited silently, making no attempt to pressure him. The only sound was the mechanical wall clock ticking steadily in the background, marking the moment of decision. Takahashi later recalled this as the most profound moral crisis of his life. "I wasn't choosing between loyalty and betrayal," he wrote after the war. "I was choosing between different conceptions of duty, duty to my country's future versus duty to its military hierarchy." August 1944. Joint Intelligence Center, Hawaii. The recording device whirred quietly in the corner as Lieutenant Takahashi sat beside Major Wilson, facing a captured Japanese communications officer. The room, designed specifically for these interactions, measured 20 feet square, with rattan chairs arranged around a low wooden table. A painted folding screen depicting Mount Fuji concealed the American stenographer. The air smelled faintly of green tea and military-issue soap. This was Takahashi's fourth interrogation session. The first three had involved junior radio men, but today's subject was Lieutenant Commander Shigeru Nomura, who had overseen communications for a destroyer squadron. The dynamic was unprecedented, a Japanese officer assisting Americans in questioning his own superior. "Please explain to the commander that we're interested in his unit's reporting procedures, not tactical information," Major Wilson said calmly. The careful phrasing reflected the methodology developed through trial and error over previous months. By focusing on technical procedures rather than combat operations, American interrogators created space for Japanese translators to participate without directly compromising military secrets. Takahashi conveyed the question in formal Japanese, adding the appropriate honorifics for Nomura's rank. The commander's eyes widened slightly, his first indication that a fellow Japanese officer was participating in the interrogation. After a long pause, he responded stiffly. "He says reporting procedures followed standard naval protocols," Takahashi translated, then hesitated. "But he's using an idiom that suggests temporary modifications were permitted under certain conditions." This cultural insight, the subtle meaning behind Nomura's phrasing, represented the unique value Japanese translators brought to interrogations. Even the most skilled Nisei Americans, raised in the United States, sometimes missed nuances that Japanese-raised officers immediately recognized. By September 1944, statistics compiled by ATIS showed dramatic improvements in intelligence-gathering efficiency. Interrogations utilizing Japanese translator assistance yielded 42% more actionable intelligence than those conducted solely by American personnel. Document translation accuracy increased from 68% to 94% when reviewed by Japanese linguists working alongside Nisei translators. The physical setup of interrogation rooms evolved based on psychological insights gained through these collaborations. Traditional Western interrogation featured a desk with interrogator elevated above the subject, a power dynamic that proved counterproductive with Japanese officers. Japanese translator advisors suggested instead arranging seating in circular patterns without obvious hierarchy, allowing rank-conscious Japanese officers to maintain face during questioning. Captain David Reynolds, who specialized in naval intelligence at Pearl Harbor, documented the transformation in his operational reports. "We redesigned our approach based on translator feedback. The room setup, conversational patterns, even the refreshments offered were adapted to facilitate Japanese cultural norms of professional interaction. Technical details mattered profoundly. Rooms were precisely arranged, temperature maintained at 72 degrees, lighting indirect rather than harsh overhead fluorescence, speaking distance calculated at 4 to 6 feet, close enough for conversation but respecting personal space. Translators advised that note-taking be discreet rather than obvious, as visible recording created reticence. The relationship between American intelligence officers and their Japanese translator colleagues evolved beyond mere operational cooperation. At Camp Angel in Byron Hot Springs, California, where 44 Japanese translators worked by late 1944, shared meals became standard. Japanese and American officers ate together in a designated mess hall, with Japanese cooks preparing occasional traditional dishes. These informal interactions, conversations about literature, hometowns, university experiences, built connections that transcended wartime divisions. Lieutenant James Foster, who supervised 6 Japanese translators at Camp Angel, wrote in his personal diary, "Remarkable to sit discussing Basho's poetry with men who were enemies 6 months ago. Yamamoto showed me how to write my name in kanji characters today. Hard to reconcile this collegiality with the brutality of fighting still raging across the Pacific." The most striking evolution occurred during actual interrogations. Initial sessions featured hesitant, minimal translations from Japanese assistants. As trust developed and moral boundaries were negotiated, many translators became active participants. offering contextual explanations and cultural background that transformed raw information into actionable intelligence. Colonel Hashimoto, a staff officer captured in the Philippines, used an obscure reference during questioning about supply lines. The Nisei translator provided the literal meaning, but Lieutenant Matsuda, the Japanese translator assisting, immediately recognized it as a reference to a pre-war military journal article describing alternate logistics strategies. This insight led intelligence analysts to identify previously unknown supply caches. These breakthroughs accelerated after the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, when increasing numbers of Japanese officers fell into American hands. The catastrophic losses, 3 Japanese carriers sunk, 395 aircraft destroyed, brought technical specialists and mid-level officers into American custody. These men possessed detailed knowledge of communication systems, code protocols, and organizational structures. Commander Walter Strahan, who led naval intelligence operations in the Central Pacific, documented the impact. The Translator collaboration program transformed our understanding of Japanese naval communications. By August 1944, we could process intercepted messages with 89% accuracy within hours rather than days. This time, advantage proved decisive in multiple engagements. For the Japanese translators themselves, this period marked an accelerating psychological transformation. Many began viewing their role not as betrayal, but as pragmatic acceptance of Japan's inevitable defeat. Lieutenant Tanaka, who assisted with communications intelligence at Pearl Harbor, expressed this evolution in a letter, censored but preserved in intelligence files. I now believe my actions may ultimately save Japanese lives by hastening the end of a war that cannot be won. This perspective would face its greatest test, as the nature of the collaboration deepened further. As American forces advanced toward Japan itself, a new and more challenging request emerged. Would Japanese translators assist in directly questioning senior officers about Japanese homeland defenses? The moral calculus, already complex, would soon become exponentially more difficult as the physical and psychological distance between interrogation rooms and their homeland narrowed. February 1945. Camp Tracy Interrogation Facility. The tension in the room crystallized as Captain Ichiro Murakami, formerly of the Imperial Japanese Navy's Communications Bureau, locked eyes with Lieutenant Takahashi across the polished oak table. 3 months earlier, Takahashi had reported directly to this man at naval headquarters in Yokosuka. Now he sat beside Major Wilson as a translator, facilitating the American interrogation of his former commanding officer. Tell him we're interested in the structural reorganization of naval communications following the Marianas' losses, Major Wilson said, his voice deliberately casual despite the significance of the request. The Americans had intercepted fragments suggesting a complete overhaul of Japanese naval codes after the disastrous losses in the Philippine Sea, but lacked the specific details needed to break the new encryption. Takahashi translated the question, deliberately using the formal Keigo speech appropriate for addressing a superior officer, a linguistic acknowledgement of the captain's status despite their reversed circumstances. The honorifics maintained a thread of cultural continuity in this unprecedented situation. Captain Murakami's face remained impassive, but his fingers tightened around the teacup before him. This man was my subordinate, he finally stated in Japanese, speaking past Takahashi directly to Major Wilson. Now he assists my enemies. Does loyalty mean nothing to you Americans? The question, left untranslated for several seconds as Takahashi struggled with its implications, hung in the air between them. This moment, replicated in interrogation rooms across Allied facilities, represented the most psychologically complex aspect of the Japanese translator program. By early 1945, approximately 78 Japanese officers and 143 enlisted men had agreed to assist with translations. Among these, 36 had taken the extraordinary step of participating in direct officer interrogations. The hierarchy so fundamental to Japanese military culture had been inverted. Junior officers now sat in judgment of their superiors. Communications specialists interrogated commanders. The psychological impact on both sides was profound. Major Gregory Nakamura, a Japanese-American officer who supervised interrogations at Fort Hunt, Virginia, documented this dynamic in his classified reports. The presence of Japanese translator collaborators creates a unique psychological pressure. Japanese officers trained to expect absolute subordination now face their former subordinates participating in their questioning. This disruption of the natural order often proves more effective than any direct interrogation technique. This effectiveness translated into measurable intelligence gains. Records from the Allied translator and interpreter section show that interrogations involving Japanese translator assistants yielded critical information in 64% of sessions, compared to 31% for standard approaches. The Pacific Military Intelligence Research section credited translator-assisted interrogations with identifying 26 previously unknown Japanese defensive installations across the Philippines and Okinawa. The physical arrangements for officer interrogations reflected careful psychological orchestration. At Camp Tracy, the officer interrogation room measured 24 feet by 18 feet, intentionally larger than standard rooms to accommodate the psychological space Japanese culture placed between ranks. The walls displayed both American and Japanese maps. Chairs were arranged with the Japanese officer facing east, a subtle reference to the Imperial Palace that acknowledged his position while reinforcing the reality of his situation. Captain Roger Blake, who specialized in naval intelligence at Pearl Harbor, noted the importance of these details. Every element of the interrogation environment communicated both respect and reality. We acknowledged rank-through-room setup and interaction protocols, but the physical setting, clearly American soil, reinforced the strategic situation. This balance proved remarkably effective. The interrogations themselves followed carefully developed protocols. American officers always addressed questions to Japanese officers directly, never through the translator. This preserved the fiction that the translator was merely a technical facilitator rather than an active participant in questioning. Japanese collaborators were instructed to maintain appropriate honorifics and formal language when translating for superior officers. Colonel Takeo Shinoda, a senior staff officer captured near Manila, later described the psychological impact in his memoir. I prepared myself for American barbarism, but instead faced something far more disorienting. My own junior officers assisting in my questioning while maintaining all the external forms of respect. This contradiction was more devastating than any physical interrogation could have been. For the Japanese translators themselves, these officer interrogations represented the most challenging test of their transformed loyalties. Lieutenant Matsuda, who assisted in questioning his former battalion commander, described the experience. I felt physically ill the first time. My body rebelled against this inversion of the natural order. Yet I had come to believe Japan's continued resistance only ensured greater suffering for our people. This belief alone allowed me to continue. The intelligence gathered through these sessions directly influenced American operational planning. When Major General Isamu Yokoyama was captured during the Battle of Manila in February 1945, his interrogation, facilitated by Lieutenant Hirota, formerly his communications officer, revealed critical details about defensive preparations on Okinawa. The identification of concealed artillery positions and command bunker locations saved an estimated 900 American lives during the subsequent Okinawa campaign. As preparations for the invasion of Japan intensified in spring 1945, the Japanese translator program expanded further. Training facilities at Fort Snelling, Minnesota, and Camp Savage, Minnesota, incorporated insights from Japanese collaborators into their curriculum for American intelligence officers. Japanese translators provided 64 lecture hours on cultural context, helping Americans understand the psychological foundations of Japanese military thinking. By June 1945, a specialized unit within the Allied translator and interpreter section had been established to support Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Japan. This unit included 28 Japanese officers who had agreed to assist with homeland intelligence analysis. Their work included identifying critical infrastructure, explaining cultural significance of potential targets, and analyzing Japanese civilian response patterns. Captain Murakami finally broke his silence in the Camp Tracy interrogation room, addressing Takahashi directly. "You believe Japan has already lost, don't you?" The question, laden with implications, cut to the heart of the moral transformation that had occurred among the Translator collaborators. Takahashi hesitated, then responded with formal respect but unmistakable conviction. "Captain, I believe Japan lost the moment we convinced ourselves that spirit could overcome industrial capacity. I now serve Japan by helping end a war that cannot be won." This exchange, recorded in interrogation transcripts, epitomized the profound transformation among Japanese translator collaborators, a journey from captured enemies to essential intelligence partners, navigating impossible ethical terrain while redefining concepts of loyalty and duty amidst history's most destructive conflict. April 1945. ATIS Headquarters, Manila. Lieutenant Takahashi studied the Japanese text before him, pencil poised above the paper. The surrender leaflet draft, prepared by American Psychological Operations staff, contained technically correct Japanese, but missed crucial cultural nuances. "This phrasing suggests weakness," he explained to Captain Wilson. "A warrior would respond better to language acknowledging his strength while offering a rational alternative to death." Takahashi carefully rewrote the passage, transforming the appeal from foreign demand to cultural permission. "The warrior who fights to the death when victory is possible serves the emperor. The warrior who sacrifices himself needlessly when defeat is certain abandons his duty to rebuild Japan." This transformation, from simple translator to cultural interpreter, represented the evolution of the Japanese translator program. By spring 1945, Japanese collaborators had transcended their initial roles as technical linguists. They had become essential advisors on Japanese psychology, culture, and military thinking. Their insights shaped Allied strategy far beyond simple language translation, influencing psychological operations, target selection, and occupation planning. Colonel Sidney Mashbeer, commanding officer of ATIS, documented this evolution in classified reports. "Our Japanese associates have progressed from reluctant translators to active participants in psychological warfare design. Their cultural insights have proven invaluable in crafting approaches that resonate with Japanese military psychology." The statistics revealed the expanding scope of this collaboration. By April 1945, Japanese translators had assisted in producing 8.2 million surrender leaflets, dropped over Japanese positions in the Philippines, Okinawa, and the home islands. These carefully crafted messages, refined through Japanese cultural insights, yielded measurable results. Surrender rates in areas targeted with translator-designed messages were 42% higher than areas receiving standard psychological operations materials. At Camp Angel's Specialized Psychological Operations Section, a dedicated team of 14 Japanese translators worked alongside American propaganda specialists. The facility included a 900-square-foot design studio where leaflets were created, a recording studio for radio broadcasts, and a testing area where messages were evaluated by recently captured prisoners. This integration of Japanese cultural knowledge transformed Allied psychological operations from crude propaganda to sophisticated communication strategically aligned with Japanese cultural values. Major Thomas Harrison, who directed psychological operations for the Southwest Pacific area, noted, "The Japanese are not surrendering because we tell them to, but because our Japanese advisors have helped us create culturally appropriate ways for them to rationalize surrender within their own value system." The impact extended beyond leaflets. Radio broadcasts developed with translator assistance reached Japanese units isolated throughout the Pacific. These broadcasts featured carefully scripted messages that preserved Japanese concepts of honor while creating psychological permission to surrender. Translator insights helped craft specific appeals to different audiences: naval personnel, army units, civilian populations, each addressing unique cultural concerns. The psychological operations breakthrough came at Leyte Gulf in October 1944, where translator-designed surrender appeals resulted in 1,115 Japanese soldiers surrendering in a 2-week period, unprecedented numbers given Japanese military doctrine forbidding surrender. Analysis of these surrenders revealed that 68% of prisoners cited specific phrases from translator-designed leaflets as influencing their decision. Lieutenant Hiroshi Matsuda, who specialized in psychological operations at ATS, described the approach. "We didn't ask them to surrender because Americans would treat them well. We explained that Japan needed them alive to rebuild after the war. This reframed surrender from personal shame to patriotic preservation." This subtle shift, preserving Japanese values while changing behavioral conclusions, reflected the deep cultural understanding Japanese translators brought to Allied operations. As American forces secured Okinawa in June 1945, the Japanese translator program yielded another unexpected benefit. Japanese collaborators helped locate hidden military supplies, underground fortifications, and concealed units. Their familiarity with Japanese military thinking allowed them to predict hiding locations and storage practices that American forces might have overlooked. Lieutenant Commander Nishimura, captured near Naha, Okinawa, worked with American intelligence to identify 6 previously undiscovered ammunition caches containing 24 tons of explosives. He later explained his cooperation. "I realized that children would find these explosives after the battle. By revealing their locations, I prevented Japanese civilian casualties." This humanitarian framing, protecting Japanese lives rather than assisting American military objectives, allowed many translators to reconcile their cooperation with their sense of national loyalty. As the war's outcome became increasingly certain, many translator collaborators shifted their focus from winning the war to shaping the peace. Captain David Reynolds documented this psychological transition. "Our Japanese associates increasingly view themselves not as aiding the defeat of Japan, but as helping create conditions for Japan's successful reconstruction. This subtle distinction has profound importance for their psychological well-being." The translator program expanded to include specialized intelligence teams focused on Japanese industrial and cultural infrastructure. Japanese architects, engineers, and urban planners who had been captured as military translators now helped map critical civilian facilities, identifying targets that should be avoided during bombing campaigns to preserve Japan's post-war recovery capacity. By July 1945, as planning for Operation Downfall, the invasion of the Japanese home islands, intensified, Japanese translators contributed detailed analyses of civilian response patterns, cultural landmarks, and local governance structures. Their work, compiled in the 412-page Cultural Infrastructure of Japan Intelligence Manual, was intended to guide occupation forces in maintaining essential social services during the invasion's aftermath. Lieutenant Takahashi completed his revision of the surrender leaflet, handing it to Captain Wilson. The captain studied the unfamiliar characters. Trusting that the message now carried cultural resonance he could never fully comprehend himself. "Will this work?" he asked simply. Takahashi considered the question carefully. "For some, yes. It provides a path that preserves honor while acknowledging reality. It speaks in a language Japanese soldiers can hear." He paused, looking at the map of Japan on the wall, his homeland now marked with potential invasion beaches and bombing targets. "I believe most Japanese would rather see surrender than annihilation, but they need permission from within their own cultural framework." The leaflet would join millions of others dropping over Japanese positions throughout the Pacific, carrying messages crafted by those who understood the nuances of the culture they hoped to influence. In creating these bridges between irreconcilable worlds, Japanese translator collaborators were already laying groundwork for a post-war relationship few could yet imagine. Their work, transcending simple translation, had become an act of cultural interpretation, explaining each side to the other across a chasm of conflict that language alone could never span. September 1945, Tokyo Bay. Lieutenant Takahashi stood on the deck of the USS Missouri, watching as Japanese Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu signed the surrender documents. As part of the Allied translation team, Takahashi occupied an extraordinary position, neither fully American nor Japanese in this historic moment, but something unprecedented. A bridge between irreconcilable worlds now forced into coexistence. The formal surrender ceremony, with its precisely arranged flags and carefully positioned representatives, symbolized the new reality that Takahashi and his fellow translator collaborators had anticipated for months. Their journey, from captured enemies to essential partners in occupation planning, had prepared them uniquely for Japan's transition from wartime enemy to peacetime reconstruction. Within weeks of the surrender, 68 Japanese translator collaborators were attached to occupation headquarters in Tokyo. Their offices, located in the requisitioned Daiichi Insurance Building just across from the Imperial Palace, placed them physically and metaphorically between American authorities and Japanese society. These men, who had once faced execution for their cooperation, now wore special armbands identifying them as Allied liaison personnel, a visible symbol of their liminal status. General Douglas MacArthur's occupation administration discovered quickly that effective governance required cultural understanding beyond simple language translation. Captain Robert Williams, who supervised translator services for occupation headquarters, documented this realization. Our most valuable translators are those who explain cultural context, not just words. Understanding why Japanese officials respond certain ways to directives proves more important than literal communication. The statistics revealed the scale of this cultural bridging effort. During the first year of occupation, Japanese translator collaborators participated in 4,287 official meetings between occupation authorities and Japanese officials. They reviewed 11,440 directive translations, ensuring cultural appropriateness beyond literal accuracy. Their insights prevented an estimated 142 significant cultural misunderstandings that might have derailed reconstruction efforts. Lieutenant Hiroshi Matsuda, who had specialized in psychological operations, found himself redesigning education materials for Japanese schools. His understanding of both American democratic values and traditional Japanese educational approaches proved invaluable in creating textbooks that introduced democratic concepts within recognizable cultural frameworks. The Education Division produced 27.8 million textbooks in the first 18 months of occupation, reaching every school-age child in Japan with materials that bridged Eastern and Western thinking. Commander James Foster, who had worked closely with Japanese translators in intelligence operations, described their unique contribution. These men understand both worlds intimately. They can explain American intentions to Japanese officials in culturally appropriate terms, and they can help us recognize when our approaches conflict with deep cultural values. The personal toll of this bridging role emerged as occupation progressed. Many translator collaborators faced suspicion from both sides. Japanese civilians sometimes viewed them as traitors, while some American occupation personnel questioned their loyalty. Lieutenant Commander Tanaka, who assisted with economic reconstruction planning, described this challenge in his private journal. "I exist between worlds now. Some Japanese neighbors won't acknowledge me on the street, while certain American officers still treat me as a potential spy. Yet I believe this middle ground, however uncomfortable, is where Japan's future will be built." For some translator collaborators, return to civilian society proved impossible. Approximately 23% chose to emigrate to the United States after the occupation, establishing new lives in California, Hawaii, and the Midwest. Others remained in occupation roles throughout the 7-year American administration, becoming permanent bridges between cultures. Their children often grew up bilingual and bicultural, embodying the new relationship between former enemies. The most remarkable legacy emerged decades later, as many former translator collaborators rose to prominence in Japan's post-war reconstruction. Takeo Yoshikawa, who had served as a translator at ATI's headquarters, became Vice President of International Operations for Toyota in 1967, helping introduce Japanese manufacturing concepts to American markets. Hiroshi Nakamura, formerly a translator at Camp Angel, served as a key consultant during the 1964 Tokyo Olympics, helping Japan reintroduce itself to the world stage. 8 former translator collaborators eventually served in Japan's post-war diplomatic corps, including 3 who became ambassadors to Western nations. A 1985 study by Tokyo University traced the influence of former military translators through Japanese corporate and governmental institutions, identifying 276 individuals who had served as translator collaborators and subsequently held significant positions in Japan's economic reconstruction. Their familiarity with American business practices, cultural values, and communication styles positioned them uniquely to guide Japan's reintegration into the international community. Lieutenant Takahashi himself returned to academic life after the occupation, becoming a professor of American studies at Kyoto University. In a 1975 interview, he reflected on his extraordinary journey. "When I translated for that first interrogation, I believed I was betraying Japan. Looking back, I see I was helping create a bridge to Japan's future. The questions I translated weren't just about military information. They were the first communications between nations that would need to understand each other after the fighting ended. The measured respect shown by American forces toward Japanese culture, significantly shaped by translator insights, yielded lasting results." Occupation historian Edwin Reischauer noted that Japanese public opinion surveys showed approval ratings for occupation policies reaching 84% by 1950, an unprecedented success in military occupation history. The cultural sensitivity demonstrated throughout the occupation, guided by translator collaborators who understood both societies, transformed potential resistance into cooperation. In 1991, during ceremonies marking the 50th anniversary of Pearl Harbor, 6 former Japanese translator collaborators were quietly honored by both American and Japanese governments. Their unique service, characterized at the time as treason by some, pragmatism by others, had been recast by history as an essential foundation for one of history's most successful national reconstructions. A memorial established at Camp Angel in 1995 bears an inscription that captures their unlikely legacy. In this place, former enemies became cultural interpreters, helping 2 nations find common language amid conflict. Their courage to stand between worlds created understanding where none seemed possible. The Japanese officers who had been stunned when Americans asked them to interrogate their own commanders had embarked on an unprecedented journey, from captured enemies to essential partners in rebuilding their nation. Their story demonstrates how understanding can emerge from conflict's darkest moments, and how those caught between worlds can become builders of bridges that endure long after battlefields have gone silent.